The wing came off at 8,000 feet, and Flying Officer Davies had exactly 11 seconds to scream. Thomas Aldridge heard the transmission in real time, standing in the operations room at RAF Kenley with a cold cup of tea forgotten in his hand. The radio crackled with static, then Davies' voice, young, terrified, disbelieving, shouting coordinates that meant nothing now because he was already tumbling through the October sky in half an aircraft. Then silence. The kind of silence that fills a room like poison gas, choking everyone who breathes it. "Christ," someone whispered. Thomas set down the cup carefully, his hands steady despite the ice flooding his veins. Around him, officers stared at the radio as if willing it to speak again, to tell them this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But Thomas knew better. He'd been expecting this call for 3 weeks now, dreading it. Lying awake at night calculating the odds, running through the mathematics of metal fatigue and stress fractures, knowing that somewhere up there, hidden beneath fabric and paint, hairline cracks were spreading through wing spars like disease through a body. Davies was the 7th pilot to die this month, the 7th funeral Thomas would attend, standing at the back in his oil-stained coveralls, while proper RAF officers in dress uniforms saluted a coffin. The 7th time he'd have to look at photographs of a young man who'd survived the Luftwaffe's guns only to be murdered by metallurgy. "Sir?" The WAF officer at the plotting table looked up at him, her face pale. Should I mark him as lost?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt thick, clogged with words that would help nothing. What could he say? That he'd warned them? That he'd written reports no one read? Filled out requisition forms that disappeared into bureaucratic void? Begged for grounding orders that would never come because Fighter Command was bleeding aircraft faster than factories could build them? He turned and walked out of the operations room, through the corridor that smelled of floor polish and anxiety, and into the cold morning air. The fog was lifting across the grass airfield, revealing the dark shapes of Hurricane fighters parked in their blast pens. His chest tightened at the sight of them. Beautiful machines. Deadly machines. Not to the enemy. To their own pilots. 37 years old, and Thomas Aldridge had never fired a shot in anger. Never climbed into a cockpit. Never felt the G-forces that crushed your vision to a gray tunnel, or the terror of tracers stitching past your canopy. He was an engineer. A man who understood load factors and material properties, who could calculate the exact point where aluminum transformed from solid metal to catastrophic failure. But right now, standing on the edge of the airfield with the smell of aviation fuel in his nostrils and the memory of Davies' scream in his ears, he felt more responsible for this war than any pilot, because he knew the secret that was killing them. The Hawker Hurricane was a magnificent aircraft. Tough, reliable, capable of absorbing punishment that would shred a Spitfire. Its fabric-covered fuselage could be repaired with dope and canvas in field conditions. Its wide-track undercarriage made it forgiving on rough airfields. Pilots loved it because it was stable, predictable, honest. But the Hurricane had a fatal flaw, and Thomas had found it. The main wing spar, the critical structural member that transferred all the lift forces from the wings to the fuselage, was attached at 4 points using large steel bolts. A simple, elegant design. Proven, reliable. Except that design had been created for peacetime flying, for gentle maneuvers and careful maintenance schedules. No one at Hawker Aircraft had anticipated what would happen when you threw these machines into combat day after day, pulling 6 and 7 Gs in violent turns, slamming through turbulence, landing hard on cratered runways because German bombers had visited the night before. The vibration from the Merlin engine was bad enough, 1,200 horsepower shaking the entire airframe like a paint mixer. But combined with combat stress, with the constant flexing and loading and unloading of the wings, something insidious was happening at those bolt holes. The metal was cracking. Microscopic fractures that grew with each flight, spreading outward from the stress concentration points like roots through concrete. Thomas had discovered it by accident 3 weeks ago while inspecting a Hurricane that had made an emergency landing with hydraulic failure. He'd been checking the wing root area and noticed something odd. A slight discoloration in the paint near one of the bolt holes. Curious, he'd scraped away the paint and found a crack so fine he'd needed a magnifying glass to see it clearly. But it was there. Unmistakable. running from the bolt hole into the main spar web. He'd felt his stomach drop, because he understood immediately what this meant. He'd spent the next 48 hours inspecting every hurricane on the station, working through the night with a flashlight and his magnifying glass, documenting what he found. The results were terrifying. Nearly 60% of the aircraft showed some degree of cracking. The older machines, the ones with the most combat hours, had cracks that made his hands shake when he measured them. Some were centimeters long, eating deep into the load-bearing structure. Any one of them could fail without warning. He'd written the report that same night, his handwriting increasingly erratic as exhaustion and horror compounded. He'd detailed the findings, included measurements and photographs, calculated the probable failure modes. He'd concluded with a recommendation that all hurricanes be immediately grounded for inspection and reinforcement. The report had gone up the chain of command and vanished like smoke. A week later, a typed memo had come back thanking him for his diligence and assuring him that the matter was being referred to the appropriate technical authorities for evaluation. In the meantime, operations would continue as normal. Thomas had stared at that memo for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to comprehend the bureaucratic insanity of it. They were going to do nothing. They were going to keep flying these aircraft, keep sending pilots up in machines that could literally fall apart in flight, because grounding the hurricane fleet would mean losing air superiority over England. He'd gone to the station commander, Group Captain Burton, and made his case directly. Burton had listened, his face grave, then shaken his head. "I believe you, Aldridge, but I can't ground my entire squadron on the basis of theoretical structural concerns. Fighter Command would have my head. We're already operating at minimum strength. If I pulled my birds off the line, who fills the gap when the next raid comes in? What about when they start falling out of the sky? Then we'll deal with that when it happens." And now it had happened. Davies, tumbling through the sky in a hurricane that had shed its port wing like a leaf from a tree. How long had that crack been growing? Days? Weeks? Had he felt anything before the failure? A vibration? A shudder? Or had it been instant, one moment flying straight and level, the next moment spinning toward the earth in an aircraft that had become a coffin? Thomas walked between the parked hurricanes now, his boots leaving dark tracks in the dew-wet grass. He reached out and touched the fabric skin of the nearest fighter, feeling the tight drum of the covering, the hard metal beneath. These machines were being held together with paint and prayers, pushed beyond their design limits because there was no choice, because the alternative was letting German bombers through to London. But there had to be something he could do. Some way to keep them flying without killing their pilots. He thought about the problem as he walked, his engineer's mind automatically analyzing possibilities. The proper solution would be to redesign the wing attachment system entirely, manufacture new spars with better stress distribution, retrofit every hurricane in service. That would take months. They didn't have months. They barely had days before the next structural failure. The next pilot lost to metal fatigue instead of enemy fire. What he needed was something quick, dirty, a field expedient that could be implemented immediately with the materials and tools they had on hand. His mind kept circling back to one possibility, so simple and crude that he'd been dismissing it as absurd. But the more he thought about it, the more it made a kind of desperate sense. If the cracks were initiating at the bolt holes due to stress concentration, he needed to redistribute that stress over a larger area. He couldn't replace the spars, but he could reinforce them. Small plates of aluminum, carefully shaped and riveted in place around the critical areas, creating a kind of splint that would bridge across the crack-prone zones and transfer loads to undamaged metal. It violated every principle of proper aircraft engineering. It would add weight. It would create new stress concentration points. It would look like something cobbled together in a backyard workshop. But it might work. And right now, might work was infinitely better than doing nothing while pilots die. Thomas turned and walked back toward the maintenance hangar, his pace quickening. The morning sun was breaking through the fog now, illuminating the airfield in golden light that seemed to mock the darkness of his thoughts. Somewhere above, the dawn patrol would be forming up, young men in their early 20s climbing to altitude to wait for the Luftwaffe raids that might or might not come today. He had to try, even if it got him court-martialed, even if it failed, because the alternative, Standing by while more pilots died from preventable structural failures was something he couldn't live with. Flight Sergeant Hodges looked up as Thomas entered the hangar, his grease-stained face showing the exhaustion of another sleepless night, keeping damaged aircraft flying. "Morning, sir. Heard about Davies? Terrible business. Hodges, I need your best metal workers. Now. And every scrap of aluminum sheet we have in stores." Hodges straightened, reading something in Thomas's expression. "What are we doing, sir?" "Something stupid," Thomas said. "Something that will probably get me kicked out of the RAF. But first, it might just save some lives." The aluminum plate felt cold in Thomas's hands, its edges sharp enough to draw blood if he wasn't careful. He held it up to the light streaming through the hangar's high windows, examining the carefully drilled rivet holes, the precise curves he'd spent the last hour shaping with hammer and dolly. It looked crude, makeshift, like something a desperate mechanic would cobble together on a damaged bomber limping home across the channel. It was perfect. "Sir, with all due respect, this looks like something my 8-year-old daughter would make in metalwork class," Flight Sergeant Hodges said, standing beside the workbench with his arms crossed. But there was no mockery in his voice, only exhaustion and a kind of desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this insane idea might work. Thomas set the plate down and picked up his notebook, flipping to the page covered in hastily sketched diagrams and calculations. "Your daughter would probably do a neater job, but she'd also take her time, make it pretty. We don't have time, and we don't need pretty. We need functional." He pointed to the drawing of a Hurricane's wing root structure, the main spar highlighted in red pencil. "The cracks always start here, at the bolt holes where the spar attaches to the fuselage frame. The stress is concentrated at these points, all the lift forces from the wing trying to rip through a relatively small area of metal. It's like trying to carry a heavy suitcase with a piece of string. Eventually, the string breaks. So these plates..." Hodges gestured at the half-dozen reinforcements laid out on the bench. "Act like spreading your fingers when you carry that suitcase. Distribute the load over a wider area. The plate bridges across the high-stress zone, transfers some of the force to the surrounding structure." Thomas picked up the plate again, running his thumb along the edge. "Will it stop the cracks completely? No. But it should slow the propagation significantly. Buy us time." "Time for what?" "Time for the Air Ministry to pull their heads out of their arses and authorize proper repairs. Time for factories to manufacture replacement spars. Time for pilots to stay alive long enough to receive them." Hodges was quiet for a moment, studying the plates with the practiced eye of a man who'd been maintaining aircraft since the days of wood and wire biplanes. "How much weight does this add?" "About 8 pounds per aircraft. Negligible impact on performance." "And you've tested this? Run the calculations?" Thomas met his gaze directly. "I've run every calculation I can think of. Stress analysis, load distribution, fatigue life estimates. On paper, it should work. But no, I haven't tested it. There's no time for testing. There's barely time for implementation." The hangar around them was a controlled chaos of activity. 3 Hurricanes sat in various states of disassembly, their engine cowlings removed, inspection panels open like surgical incisions revealing the mechanical viscera beneath. Ground crew moved between them with the efficient urgency of men who knew that every hour an aircraft spent on the ground was an hour it couldn't defend the skies over England. Through the open hangar doors, Thomas could see more Hurricanes taxiing out for the morning patrol, their Merlin engines producing that distinctive roar that he'd come to associate with both hope and dread. How many of them were flying with cracks spreading through their wing spars right now? How many pilots were climbing to altitude in aircraft that could fail catastrophically at any moment? "Right then," Hodges said, breaking the silence. "Show me how you want these fitted." They worked on the first aircraft together, a Hurricane with the weathered markings of No. 73 Squadron and over 200 combat hours logged. Thomas had chosen it deliberately. If any aircraft on the station was likely to show advanced fatigue damage, it would be this veteran. The work was tedious, exacting. First, they removed the lower wing root inspection panels, exposing the main spar and its attachment points. Then Thomas used his magnifying glass to examine every millimeter of the structure, mapping the cracks he found. And there were many. Some were barely visible, hairline fractures that caught the light like spider silk. Others were deeper, more developed, the kind that made his breath catch in his throat because he knew how close this aircraft had come to catastrophic failure. Jesus Christ, Hodges breathed, leaning in close to see what Thomas was pointing at. That one's nearly 2 centimeters long. And it's propagating along the grain structure of the aluminum. See how it branches here? Thomas traced the crack with the tip of a scribe, his hand steady despite the cold fear in his gut. Another week, maybe 2, and this would have reached critical length. The spar would have failed under combat loading. Who flies this bird? Thomas consulted the maintenance log clipped to the nearby workbench. Pilot Officer Henderson, 22 years old. 3 confirmed kills, engaged to a girl in Surrey. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Henderson didn't know how close he'd come to dying. Would probably never know, if Thomas's fix worked. Would go on flying, go on fighting, never realizing that the wing he trusted to keep him airborne had been on the verge of tearing itself apart. They positioned the first reinforcement plate carefully, using the jig Thomas had fabricated to ensure proper alignment. The plate curved around the bolt hole, its edges extending far enough to bridge the cracked area and transfer loads to undamaged metal. Hodges held it in place, while Thomas drilled the first rivet hole, the high-pitched whine of the hand drill cutting through the ambient noise of the hangar. "Steady," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Hodges. His hands were cramping from the awkward angle, his back protesting the hunched position. But he couldn't afford to rush. One misaligned hole, one poorly set rivet, and the entire reinforcement could fail, potentially making the situation worse instead of better. The first rivet went in clean, the pneumatic gun chattering as it compressed the aluminum shaft and formed the shop head. Thomas checked the installation carefully, feeling the rivet head, ensuring it was properly seated and flush. Then the next hole, and the next. 12 rivets per plate, 4 plates per aircraft. 48 individual fasteners, each one a tiny anchor point holding back catastrophic failure. It took them 4 hours to complete the first installation. 4 hours of drilling and riveting and checking and rechecking, while around them the morning turned to afternoon and the sounds of combat rumbled in the distant sky. Twice, the air raid sirens wailed, sending ground crews scrambling for shelter. But Thomas and Hodges kept working, because stopping meant another aircraft would go up without protection. Another pilot would climb into a machine that might kill him through no fault of the enemy. When they finally finished, Thomas stepped back and examined their work. The reinforcement plates were visible, their bare aluminum contrasting with the painted structure around them. It looked exactly like what it was, a field modification, a desperate fix implemented by men who'd run out of proper solutions. Any engineer from Hawker would take one look and be horrified. But it was done, and unless Thomas had made a catastrophic error in his calculations, it should work. "Run up the engine," he said to Hodges. "I want to check for vibration issues." They pulled the Hurricane out of the hangar and into the dispersal area. A crew chief climbed into the cockpit and, after running through the pre-start checklist, engaged the starter. The Merlin coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that Thomas felt in his chest. The propeller became a translucent disc, the slipstream whipping back past the cockpit canopy. Thomas stood beside the wing root, his hand pressed against the metal, feeling the vibration transmitted through the airframe. It was pronounced. The Merlin was not a smooth engine, but no worse than usual. The reinforcement plates weren't introducing any obvious harmonic problems. He moved around the aircraft, checking each installation point, while the engine cycled through different power settings. After 10 minutes, he signaled for shutdown. The Merlin wound down with a descending whistle, the propeller clicking to a stop. Thomas waited for the metal to cool slightly, then removed one of the inspection panels and examined the rivets. No signs of movement or loosening. No gaps forming between the plates and the structure. Everything looked solid. "Well?" Hodges asked. "It's holding. Now we just have to see if it holds under combat loads." Thomas straightened, his back cracking audibly. "How many metal workers can you spare from regular maintenance duties?" "For this, all of them. We can defer the routine inspections for a few days if it means keeping wings attached. Get them started on the next aircraft. I'll fabricate more plates." "We need to prioritize based on flight hours. The veterans first, then work our way down the line." They fell into a rhythm over the next hours. Thomas at the workbench, measuring and cutting and drilling the reinforcement plates. Hodges and his crew installing them, aircraft by aircraft, working with grim efficiency. Word spread through the station about what they were doing. Pilots drifted into the hangar between sorties, watching the work with the intense interest of men whose lives depended on the outcome. Squadron leader Peter Townsend appeared in the late afternoon, still wearing his flight gear, his face showing the particular exhaustion that came from hours of high-altitude combat. He watched in silence as Hodges riveted a plate onto his personal Hurricane, then approached Thomas at the workbench. "Is this official?" he asked quietly. Thomas didn't look up from the plate he was shaping. "No." "Has it been approved by anyone with actual authority?" "No." "Do you know what you're doing?" Now Thomas did look up, meeting Townsend's eyes. "I know that Davies died this morning because a wing spar failed. I know that Henderson's aircraft was probably 2 weeks away from the same failure. I know that if we do nothing, more pilots will die. So yes, squadron leader, I know exactly what I'm doing." Townsend was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Right then. Carry on." He turned to leave, then paused. "Aldridge? Thank you." After he left, Thomas returned to his work, but Townsend's words stayed with him. "Thank you." As if what he was doing was somehow noble, heroic. But there was nothing heroic about this. He was terrified. Terrified that his calculations were wrong, that the reinforcements would fail, that he'd be responsible for even more deaths. Terrified that he was overstepping his authority in ways that would end his career. Terrified that history would remember him as the engineer who thought he knew better than everyone else and killed pilots with his arrogance. But more terrifying than any of that was the alternative: doing nothing. By the time darkness fell, they'd completed modifications on 6 aircraft. 6 Hurricanes that now carried Thomas's crude reinforcements. 6 pilots who would fly tomorrow with slightly better odds of survival. It wasn't enough. There were 32 Hurricanes on the station, and more across fighter command. But it was a start. Thomas stood outside the hangar in the blackout darkness, listening to the distant rumble of German bombers heading for London. Somewhere up there, night fighters were hunting them, Hurricanes and bow fighters stalking through the darkness. Were any of them flying with cracked spars, with metal fatigue eating away at their structural integrity? He'd barely slept in 3 days. His hands ached from the work, his eyes burned from the close detail. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while there were still aircraft to modify, still pilots to protect. Behind him, light leaked from the hangar's blackout curtains. Inside, Hodges and his crew were already starting on the next Hurricane, working through the night because that's what the situation demanded. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter against the cold and turned back to the hangar. There was work to do. The call came at dawn on the 3rd day, crackling through the tannoy speakers with the urgency that meant only one thing: bandits inbound. Thomas was in the hangar, hunched over his workbench with a half-finished reinforcement plate and hands that had forgotten what it felt like not to ache. He'd slept maybe 4 hours in the last 72, catching brief moments of unconsciousness in a chair while Hodges and the crew continued working. 17 Hurricanes now carried his modifications. 17 aircraft whose pilots might live through structural failures that would have killed them a week ago. Might. That word haunted him. Outside, the dawn patrol was already scrambling. He could hear the Merlins roaring to life, that distinctive cough and thunder, as 12 cylinders awoke and spun propellers into invisible discs. Thomas walked to the hangar doors and watched them taxi out, their navigation lights winking in the pre-dawn darkness like fireflies. The 3rd aircraft in line was Henderson's Hurricane, the one with the 2-centimeter crack that had been days away from catastrophic failure. Now it carried Thomas's plates, those crude aluminum splints that either would or wouldn't keep the wings attached when Henderson threw the aircraft into violent combat maneuvers. This was the moment. The real test. Not calculations on paper or engine run-ups on the ground, but actual combat at 20,000 feet with G-forces trying to tear the airframe apart, and Messerschmitt cannons adding their own destructive contributions. Thomas's mouth was dry. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. "They'll be fine, sir," Hodges said quietly, appearing beside him. The flight sergeant looked like death warmed over, eyes bloodshot, face gray with exhaustion, hands wrapped in bandages where rivet guns had bitten him. But he'd never complained, never suggested they slow down. "Your modification is solid. I've been working on aircraft for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of bodge jobs. This isn't one of them. You can't know that. Not until they're tested under actual combat loads. No, but I believe it. And more importantly, they believe it." Hodges gestured toward the departing Hurricanes. "Townsend told his pilots what you're doing. Word spread through the squadron. They know their aircraft have been reinforced. They trust you." That made it worse somehow. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any physical burden Thomas had ever carried. The Hurricanes lifted off one by one, climbing into the lightening sky and forming up in their 3 ship sections. Within minutes, they disappeared into the clouds, heading southeast toward the coast, where radar had picked up the incoming German formation. Thomas returned to the hangar, but he couldn't focus on work. His hands shaped metal automatically while his mind was elsewhere, imagining what was happening at altitude. The radar vectors guiding the fighters to intercept. The moment of visual contact, black crosses materializing out of cloud, sunlight glinting off canopies and gun barrels. The radio discipline breaking down into shouted warnings and position calls as the formation scattered into individual dogfights. And through it all, would the wings stay attached? 20 minutes passed. 30. The radio in the hangar was tuned to the squadron frequency, but Thomas had learned to filter out the combat chatter. Most of it was incomprehensible anyway, terse code words and position calls that meant nothing to him. He listened instead for the silences, for the pauses that might indicate something had gone wrong. 45 minutes. Then finally the sound of returning aircraft. Merlins at reduced throttle, the pitch changing as pilots lowered undercarriage and flaps for landing. Thomas dropped his tools and hurried outside. The Hurricanes came in one by one, touching down on the grass runway with the controlled violence of combat landings. No gentle approaches here. Just get on the ground fast and clear the circuit for the next aircraft. Thomas counted them as they taxied past. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where was the 5th? His chest tightened. He scanned the sky, searching for the missing aircraft. Had it been shot down? Or had the wing spar failed, sending another pilot tumbling to his death? Then he saw it. A Hurricane approaching from the south, lower and slower than the others, white coolant vapor trailing from the engine cowling. Battle damage. The aircraft came in hot, touched down hard, bounced once, then settled and rolled to a stop at the far end of the field. Henderson's Hurricane. Thomas recognized the identification letters. He started running before he'd consciously decided to move, sprinting across the grass toward the parked aircraft. By the time he arrived, ground crew were already swarming over it, and Henderson was climbing out of the cockpit, his face pale beneath his oxygen mask. "Sir, are you all right?" Thomas gasped, his lungs burning from the run. Henderson pulled off his mask and helmet, revealing sweat-soaked hair and the particular expression of someone who'd just seen death up close and personal. "Took cannon fire in the engine. Glycol line severed. Thought I was going to have to ditch in the channel, but she held together long enough to get home." Thomas's eyes went immediately to the wing roots, searching for any signs of structural failure. The fabric skin showed multiple bullet holes, and there was damage to the starboard aileron, but the wings themselves appeared intact. "How hard were you pulling? Maximum G-loading?" Henderson gave him an odd look. "Full deflection turns. 6, maybe 7 Gs. Why? No structural vibrations? No unusual handling?" "No more than usual. She flies like she always has, just with a trail of coolant and a couple extra holes." Henderson frowned. "Wait, you're the engineer, aren't you? The one who's been modifying the aircraft?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. 7 Gs. Henderson had pulled 7 Gs in an aircraft that 3 days ago had been on the verge of wing spar failure, and the reinforcement had held. The wings had stayed attached. "Right then," Henderson said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "In that case, thank you. Whatever you did, it works. I threw this bird around like I was trying to tear her apart, and she never complained once." After Henderson left for debriefing, Thomas stood beside the damaged Hurricane and carefully removed the inspection panels. His hands were shaking now, reaction setting in. The reinforcement plates were still in place, all 48 rivets holding firm. There was some minor deformation where the aluminum had flexed under load, exactly what the calculations had predicted, but no signs of imminent failure. More importantly, when he examined the original crack with his magnifying glass, he could see that its propagation had been arrested. The crack hadn't grown. The stress had been successfully redistributed. It worked. His stupid, crude, desperate fix had actually worked. Thomas sat down hard on the grass, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him for 3 days evaporated all at once, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. His vision blurred. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Sir?" One of the ground crew was looking at him with concern. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Thomas managed. "Just give me a minute." But he wasn't fine. He was falling apart, all the fear and stress and responsibility catching up with him at once. He'd gambled with pilots' lives based on hasty calculations and desperate hope. If he'd been wrong, if the reinforcement had failed, Henderson would be dead. Possibly killed by Thomas's modification rather than in spite of it. But he hadn't been wrong. The engineering was sound. The fix worked. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself. Combat sortie after combat sortie, the modified Hurricanes went up and came back, some with battle damage, some untouched, but all with their wings still attached. Pilots reported no handling issues, no structural anomalies. The reinforcement plates were doing exactly what Thomas had designed them to do. Word spread beyond RAF Kenley. Other stations started hearing about the Aldridge fix, that's what they were calling it now to his embarrassment, and requesting information. Engineers from other squadrons visited to examine the modification, taking measurements and photographs, asking technical questions that Thomas answered while trying not to think about the fact that he still had no official authorization for any of this. Group Captain Burton called him to his office one afternoon, and Thomas went with his stomach churning, certain this was the court-martial he'd been expecting. But Burton simply handed him a file folder and told him to read it. Inside were reports from 5 different RAF stations, all documenting wing spar cracks in their Hurricane fleets. All requesting permission to implement the Aldridge fix. All asking if Squadron Leader Thomas Aldridge could be temporarily assigned to their stations to oversee the modifications. "The Air Ministry is furious," Burton said, lighting his pipe with deliberate calm. "You've implemented an unauthorized modification to operational aircraft. You've circumvented proper engineering review processes. You've violated about 16 different regulations." Thomas said nothing. What could he say? "On the other hand," Burton continued, "you've probably saved a dozen lives already, and potentially hundreds more across Fighter Command. The technical boffins at Farnborough have examined your work and grudgingly admitted that while it's crude and inelegant, it's also effective. Hawker Aircraft is already designing a proper retrofit kit based on your concept." He set down his pipe and looked directly at Thomas. "So here's what's going to happen. The Air Ministry is going to quietly authorize your modification as a temporary field expedient. You're going to receive a commendation for innovative engineering under combat conditions. And you're going to spend the next month traveling to every Hurricane squadron in Fighter Command, teaching their maintenance crews how to implement your fix." Thomas blinked. "Sir? You stuck your neck out, Aldridge. You risked your career, possibly your freedom, because you believed it was the right thing to do. That takes a particular kind of courage." Burton picked up his pipe again. "Not the kind that gets you a medal, though if I have my way, you'll get one of those too. But the kind that actually matters. The kind that saves lives when no one's watching." Walking back to the hangar afterward, Thomas felt strange. Lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from his shoulders. The fear was still there, would probably always be there. But it was tempered now by something else. Validation, maybe. Or just the simple knowledge that he'd done what needed doing, and it had worked. Hodges met him at the hangar entrance, grease-stained and grinning. "Heard you're going to be famous, sir. The engineer who saved Fighter Command with a stupid fix." "It's not stupid if it works," Thomas replied. "That's what I told them." Hodges gestured inside, where his crew was working on another Hurricane. We've got 6 more to do before the end of the week. Then I suppose you'll be off to spread your genius elsewhere? Thomas smiled despite himself. Something like that. He paused, looking at the men working in the hangar, at the aircraft that lined the dispersal area outside, at the whole impossible machinery of war that somehow kept functioning despite everything. Hodges, thank you for trusting me when you had no reason to. Had every reason to, sir. You knew what needed doing, and you did it. That's enough reason for anyone. The train rattled through the English countryside, carrying Thomas Aldridge away from RAF Kenley for the first time in 4 months. Outside the window, spring was transforming the landscape. Fields turning green, trees budding with new life. A world that seemed determined to prove that beauty could exist even while men fought and died in the skies above. Thomas barely noticed. His briefcase sat on his lap, heavy with technical drawings and implementation guides for the reinforcement modification that now bore his name. 6 more stations to visit. 6 more groups of exhausted maintenance crews to train. 6 more chances to look into the eyes of young pilots and know that his crude aluminum plates were all that stood between them and catastrophic structural failure. He was tired. Not the physical exhaustion of those first desperate days, that had faded with regular sleep and proper meals. This was something deeper, a weariness that lived in his bones and colored everything gray. The weight of responsibility, maybe. Or just the accumulated stress of knowing that lives depended on calculations he'd performed in the middle of the night with shaking hands and cold fear in his gut. The train compartment door slid open, and a young RAF officer entered, his uniform crisp despite the journey. He glanced at Thomas, noted the engineering insignia on his shoulder, and nodded politely before taking a seat. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sound the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. "Excuse me," the officer said finally. "Are you Squadron Leader Aldridge, the one who developed the Hurricane wing modification?" Thomas looked up, surprised. "Yes." "Have we met?" "No, sir. But I flew Hurricanes in number 43 Squadron. Last month, one of my section mates put his aircraft into a 9G turn during a dogfight. Split S maneuver to shake a 109 off his tail, the kind of flying that should have torn the wings clean off." The young officer's expression was serious now, intense. But they held. The aircraft held together. "And when our engineering officer examined it afterward, he found your reinforcement plates had arrested cracks that would have killed him otherwise." He extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you, sir. Jimmy, Flight Lieutenant James Cooper. He's alive because of what you did. He's getting married next month. His fiancée will actually have a husband to walk down the aisle instead of a folded flag and a telegram." Thomas shook his hand, throat tight. "I'm glad he made it. That's good to hear." After the officer left at the next station, Thomas sat alone with his thoughts. Jimmy Cooper. A name attached to a life saved, to a wedding that would happen, to children who might someday be born because an engineer had stayed awake one night staring at cracks in aluminum and refused to accept that nothing could be done. How many other names were there? How many pilots had survived because of those crude reinforcement plates? The official reports documented 17 confirmed cases where the modification had prevented structural failure, but Thomas suspected the real number was higher. Failures that never happened, cracks that never propagated to critical length, pilots who simply landed safely without ever knowing how close they'd come to disaster. The train pulled into a small station, and Thomas gathered his briefcase. RAF Hornchurch was next, another fighter station with another squadron of Hurricanes that needed his attention. The routine was familiar now. Arrive, inspect the aircraft, identify the worst cases, train the maintenance crews, supervise the first few installations to ensure proper technique. Stay just long enough to be confident they could continue without him, then move on to the next station. It was important work. Vital work. But God, he missed home. He hadn't seen Margaret and Emily in 2 months. Phone calls weren't enough, couldn't capture the way his daughter's eyes lit up when she laughed, or the quiet comfort of his wife's presence. They were safe in Berkshire, far from the bombs that still fell on London most nights. But safety felt like poor compensation for absence. At Hornchurch, the station engineering officer met him at the train platform, a grizzled flight lieutenant named Morrison, who looked like he'd been maintaining aircraft since the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. Squadron Leader Aldridge, welcome to Hornchurch. We've got 22 hurricanes for you to look at, and frankly, sir, some of them are in shocking condition. We've been running them hard, and it shows. They drove to the airfield in a battered staff car, Morrison talking the whole way about maintenance challenges, parts shortages, the constant struggle to keep enough aircraft serviceable for operations. Thomas listened with half his attention, the other half noting the signs of war's passage. Bomb craters hastily filled, burned-out buildings, the peculiar emptiness that came from too many losses. The hangars at Hornchurch looked like every other hangar he'd visited. Organized chaos, the smell of oil and metal and human sweat, ground crews moving with the efficient desperation of men fighting an invisible war against mechanical entropy. But the hurricanes here looked worse than most. Battle damage poorly repaired, panels that didn't quite fit, engines that coughed and smoked when run up. Thomas set down his briefcase and got to work. The inspection process was routine by now. Remove panels, examine structure, use the magnifying glass to search for cracks, mark each finding in his notebook with precise measurements and locations. Prioritize aircraft by severity. Some had cracks so advanced that he wondered how they were still flying. Others showed only the earliest signs of fatigue, tiny initiations that would propagate over time, but weren't immediately critical. One hurricane in particular made his blood run cold. The starboard wing spar had a crack nearly 4 centimeters long, eating deep into the load-bearing web. The port side was only marginally better. This aircraft should have failed already. The fact that it hadn't was either a miracle or just dumb luck. "Who flies this one?" Thomas asked Morrison. The engineering officer consulted his clipboard. "That would be Squadron Leader Bader's personal mount. He's been flying it since—" "Douglas Bader? The legless pilot?" "The same. He's been leading number 242 Squadron from Hornchurch since we reformed. Aggressive as they come, pushes his aircraft to the absolute limit." Morrison paused, looking at the crack Thomas had found. "Christ, he's been flying around in that?" "Not anymore." Thomas straightened, his decision made. "This aircraft is grounded immediately. No exceptions, no arguments. Get me Bader." 10 minutes later, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader stumped into the hangar on his artificial legs, his face set in the particular expression of a man who'd been told something he didn't want to hear and was preparing to argue about it. He was younger than Thomas had expected, maybe 30, with the kind of intense energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "You're grounding my aircraft?" His voice was clipped, precise, carrying the accent of good schools and better breeding. "I am. The wing spars are compromised beyond safe operation. If you'd pulled one more high-G maneuver, they would have failed." Bader's jaw tightened. "I've been flying that Hurricane for 6 months. She's never let me down." "She was about to." Thomas gestured to the exposed spar. "See this crack? It's propagated past the point where normal operational loads should have caused failure. You've been extraordinarily lucky. But luck runs out." They stared at each other for a long moment, wills clashing silently. Then Bader shifted his weight, an odd movement that reminded Thomas of the artificial legs hidden beneath the uniform, and nodded slowly. "Show me." Thomas showed him, explained the stress analysis, the fatigue propagation, the mathematics of failure. Bader listened with the focused intensity of a natural pilot, someone who understood machines at an intuitive level, even if he couldn't calculate the numbers. When Thomas finished, Bader ran his finger along the crack, feeling the rough edge where metal had begun to tear. "How do you fix it?" he asked quietly. "Reinforcement plates. Redistribute the stress, arrest the crack propagation. It won't restore the spar to original strength, but it will keep it from failing catastrophically. The proper fix is replacement, but we don't have time or parts for that." "How long for your modification?" 6 hours, maybe 8. "We'll work through the night if necessary." Bader nodded slowly. "Do it. And while you're at it, do every other Hurricane on this station. I want my pilots flying aircraft that won't fall apart on them." He paused, then extended his hand. "Thank you, Squadron Leader, for caring enough to ground me when I was too stupid to see the danger." After Bader left, Thomas and Morrison's crew set to work. The pattern was familiar now, almost meditative. Fabricate plates, position carefully, drill holes, set rivets. Each one a tiny act of salvation, a small defiance against the forces trying to tear these machines apart. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the hangar lights coming on as darkness fell. Outside, Thomas could hear aircraft returning from patrols, the distant rumble of German bombers heading for London, the crump of anti-aircraft fire. The war continued, indifferent to the small dramas of engineering and maintenance. Around midnight, Morrison called for a break. They sat on ammo boxes eating sandwiches that tasted like sawdust, drinking tea that had gone cold hours ago. The maintenance crews sprawled around them, too tired to talk, just existing in that peculiar space between exhaustion and collapse. "Tell me something," Morrison said quietly. "That first night, when you came up with this fix. Were you scared?" Thomas thought about lying, about maintaining the professional distance that officers were supposed to project. But he was too tired for pretense. "Terrified," he admitted. "I was convinced I was wrong, that the modification would fail, that I'd be responsible for killing the very pilots I was trying to save. I didn't sleep for 3 days because I kept imagining all the ways it could go wrong. But you did it anyway. Because doing nothing was worse. At least if I tried and failed, I'd know I'd made an effort. But standing by, watching pilots die from preventable failures..." Thomas shook his head. "I couldn't live with that." Morrison was quiet for a moment, then raised his tea mug in a small salute. "To stupid fixes that save lives." "To stupid fixes," Thomas echoed. They finished Bader's Hurricane at dawn, just as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas stood back and examined the installation one final time, checking each rivet, each plate, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. The modification looked as crude as ever, bare aluminum against painted structure, obvious and inelegant. But it would work. He knew that now, not just from calculations but from experience, from 17 documented saves and countless others that would never make it into official reports. From pilots who walked away from flights that should have killed them, from families who would remain whole instead of receiving telegrams. Bader appeared as they were cleaning up, his face showing the lack of sleep that came from watching someone else work on your aircraft. He walked around the Hurricane slowly, examining the modifications, running his hands over the reinforcement plates. "It's ugly," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "But it works?" "Yes, sir." Bader nodded, then climbed into the cockpit with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to compensate for missing legs. The Merlin fired up on the first try, settling into its characteristic idle rumble. Thomas watched as Bader taxied out, took off, and climbed away into the morning sky. 20 minutes later the Hurricane returned, making a low pass over the airfield before landing. Bader taxied in, shut down, and climbed out with a smile on his face. "She flies like she always did. Maybe a bit heavier, but nothing significant." He paused, then added quietly, "Thank you, Aldridge. Truly." Thomas spent another week at Hornchurch, training Morrison's crews, supervising installations, ensuring the modification was properly implemented across the entire squadron. Then it was time to move on again. Another station, another group of Hurricanes, another set of pilots whose lives might depend on crude aluminum plates and hastily set rivets. On his last evening, Thomas sat alone in the officers' mess, writing a letter to Margaret by the dim light of a table lamp. He tried to explain what he'd been doing, why it mattered, but the words felt inadequate. How do you convey the weight of responsibility? The fear and hope and desperate determination? The strange pride that came from knowing you'd made a difference, even in some small way? He settled finally for simple truth. "I miss you both terribly. I'll be home as soon as I can. Tell Emily that her father is thinking of her, and that the work I'm doing here matters. Lives are being saved. That has to be enough." 6 months later, Hawker Aircraft released their official retrofit kit for Hurricane Wing spar reinforcement. It was more sophisticated than Thomas's field expedient, engineered properly, tested thoroughly, manufactured to exacting standards. It was, in every technical sense, superior. But it was based fundamentally on the same concept: small plates, carefully positioned, redistributing stress to prevent catastrophic failure. The Aldridge fix, made respectable. By then, Thomas was back at Kenley, back to routine maintenance and engineering duties, back to a life that looked almost normal if you didn't count the nightly bomber raids and the constant flow of battle-damaged aircraft. The modification he'd pioneered had spread throughout Fighter Command, then to other RAF units, eventually even to Allied air forces. He never received the medal group Captain Burton had predicted. The official commendation was filed away somewhere in Air Ministry archives, gathering dust alongside thousands of other wartime paperwork. But occasionally, pilots would seek him out to shake his hand and say thank you. Sometimes they brought photographs. Weddings, christenings, ordinary moments of life that might never have happened without crude aluminum plates holding wings to fuselages. Those moments made it worthwhile. The war ground on. Hurricanes were eventually replaced by newer fighters, aircraft designed from the start to handle the brutal stresses of combat. Thomas's modification became obsolete, a historical footnote about desperate measures in desperate times. But on quiet nights, when he lay awake remembering, Thomas would think about those first days, the fear and determination, the sound of Davies screaming as his wing tore away, the weight of responsibility that had nearly crushed him, and the simple, profound satisfaction of having done something that mattered, even if it was just stupid enough to work. Outside his window, the stars shone down on England, the same stars that pilots navigated by, that illuminated battlefields and bombing runs and all the terrible beauty of war. And somewhere out there, hurricanes still flew with reinforcement plates holding their wings together, carrying pilots safely home. It was, Thomas thought, enough. The end.